One morning, Joe Redcloud walked out to his field and found a fence. Not his fence. 18 feet inside his land. Sitting right across the drainage channel his great-grandfather had dug in 1908. The channel that kept 80 acres alive. The HOA said their survey was correct. The county commissioner drove out to suggest Joe think carefully about the cost of a legal fight. The insurance company raised his premium 42%. And someone started telling people in town that his family never really owned that land to begin with. 3 native families, the same surveying company, the same 12 months. This wasn't a mistake, this was a pattern. And Joe Redcloud had a notebook, written in 1901, that was about to change everything. The fence was 18 feet off. Joe Redcloud knew it before he measured it. He knew it the way he knew weather. Not from instruments or apps on a phone. From the particular way the morning light fell across the pasture and hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. He stood at the east edge of his property at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. The new fence line ran straight as a rifle shot from the county road all the way to the tree line at the base of the hill. Steel posts, galvanized wire, clean and new and wrong, 18 feet wrong. He knew because 18 feet was the width of the drainage channel that ran along the eastern boundary of the Redcloud land. His great-grandfather George had dug that channel in 1908 with a borrowed mule and a rented plow. George understood something that the engineers who came later with their computer models had to spend a lot of money to learn. Water wants to go north in this valley. If you let it go north through a controlled channel, the 80 acres on the upper bench stays dry and produces. If you don't, it floods every spring and produces nothing. The drainage channel had kept the upper bench alive for 116 years. The new fence sat on the western edge of it. After the fence, the channel belonged to Elk Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Joe drank his cold coffee. He looked at the fence for a long time. Then he walked back to the house. Clara was at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, grading papers. She taught 8th grade English at the school in town. 31 years, the kind of woman who finishes what she starts. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his face. She said, "The fence. Yes. How bad? 18 feet. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the stack of papers. "That's the drainage channel," she said. "Yes. They know that." "Yes, they did it on purpose. That's my feeling." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was 61 years old. She had been married to Joe Redcloud for 38 years. She had seen his face in most of the configurations it was capable of making. This one was the configuration she liked least. A man deciding whether to be angry or patient, not yet knowing which one was going to win. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make fresh coffee." He sat down. The Redcloud land in Glacier County, Montana, was 340 acres of mixed pasture, hay ground, and dry land wheat. In the family since 1901, when Joe's great-grandfather George filed the homestead claim. George Redcloud was Northern Cheyenne, born 1868. He had survived the Northern Cheyenne exodus of 1878 as a boy of 10. The desperate march north from Indian Territory, the soldiers, the cold, the years afterward on the reservation that were supposed to be permanent and were not anything like living. He had walked away from the reservation in 1899 with $40 and a horse and a conviction that land was worth trying for. If a man was willing to work hard enough and document carefully enough and not let anyone tell him the paper was invalid. He filed the claim at 33, built the first cabin himself, dug the drainage channel in 1908 after 3 consecutive wet springs flooded the upper bench and took the wheat. What Joe knew about George came partly from family stories and partly from a small brown notebook wrapped in oilcloth that sat in a metal box on the shelf of the equipment shed. Joe had read it twice in his life. The first time when Raymond died, the second time this week, after he found the fence. George's son Edward had taken over in 1934, Edward's son Raymond in 1961. Raymond was Joe's father. Joe had taken over in 1989 when Raymond's knees gave out, and the doctor said the winters were going to kill him. Raymond moved to Tucson. He called every Sunday. He died in 2011 at 84, still calling every Sunday right up to the end, still asking about the upper bench. Joe had farmed the land for 35 years, made it better every year, not by much every year. But the direction was always the same. Better soil, better fences, equipment old but maintained with what Ray Gruber at the implement dealer called almost obsessive precision, and Ray had not meant it as a complaint. The operation was not large by Montana standards, but it was his and it was paid for, and it had fed the Redcloud family for 4 generations. Joe intended to hand it to his daughter Sarah in the same condition Raymond had handed it to him. Paid for, producing, better than it had been. This was the year 2022. Elk Ridge Estates had appeared in the valley below the Redcloud land in 2015. Joe remembered the first day he saw the surveyor's stakes going in. He had been on the bench fixing fence, and he looked down at the flat ground that used to be the old Peterson place, and watched a man in an orange vest driving stakes into the ground and thought, "Here it comes." Here it comes was not a new thought for Joe Redcloud. It was the thought of a man whose great-grandfather had been told repeatedly, in different languages and different legal frameworks, that the land he worked was not truly his, that the claim could be questioned, that the boundary could be redrawn. George had been Northern Cheyenne in a state that had not been kind to Northern Cheyenne. He had filed the claim anyway. He had dug the channel anyway. He had written things down in a small, careful hand for whoever came after. Joe carried all of that the way you carry a stone in your pocket, not threatening anyone with it, just aware of the weight. For 7 years after the first stakes went in, the answer to "Here it comes" had been, "Mind your own business." Elk Ridge Estates grew from 40 lots to 220 in those 7 years. The houses were large and identical in the way that subdivisions are identical. The people who moved in were mostly from Kalispell or Missoula or Seattle, mostly retired or working remotely. The kind of people who said they wanted to live in Montana and meant they wanted to live in a house that looked like Montana from the outside. Joe had nothing against them specifically. He had helped one of them, a man named Frank Dolan, pull his truck out of the ditch on Route 9 in January of 2019. Frank had offered money. Joe had declined. Frank had sent a bottle of good whiskey 2 days later. Joe had appreciated that. The HOA was a different matter. The Elk Ridge Estates Homeowners Association was run by a man named Derek Voss, 50 years old, moved from Phoenix in 2017, sold his landscaping company for a number he mentioned often in conversation, and arrived in Glacier County with the energy of a man who had decided that running a homeowners association was the appropriate next use of his considerable management skills. Joe had met Derek Voss once before the fence. April of the previous year at the county zoning meeting, an item on the agenda about a proposed access road. Joe went prepared to say his piece. Voss spoke for 12 minutes about infrastructure access and synergy and stakeholder engagement. He wore a sport coat that fit him well. He had the kind of haircut that costs more than Joe's last pair of work boots. When Joe stood up to speak, Voss looked at him the way men sometimes looked at Joe in official settings. The look that starts at the top of the head and moves slightly down and tries not to register anything it sees along the way. Then the polite expression reassembles itself. Then the listening face. Joe said his piece, informats, the survey, the property lines, the drainage implications, clear and specific and accurate. The county commissioner, Gerald Taft, said, "We'll take that under consideration, Mr. Redcloud." Gerald Taft always said he would take things under consideration. He had been taking Joe's concerns under consideration for 20 years. After the meeting, Voss came up to Joe in the parking lot. "Mr. Redcloud, I want you to know we don't see our community and the existing agricultural properties as being in conflict. I think there's room for everyone in this valley." Joe had shaken his hand and driven home and told Clara about it. Clara said, "He said farms are attractive to his residents." "Yes, like scenery. That was my interpretation." "He doesn't see you as a partner," Clara said. "He sees you as a feature." That had been 14 months ago. Now there was a fence. Joe spent the morning measuring. He had a surveyor's tape 100 feet that had been in the equipment shed since Raymond's time. He ran it from the county road marker, an iron pipe driven by state surveyors in 1962, still solid, along the line of the new fence and then back along what he knew to be the actual property line. 18 feet and 4 inches. He measured it 3 times. Then he went back to the house and called his daughter. Sarah Redcloud was 36 years old. She lived in Missoula, where she worked as a licensed land surveyor for a firm called Western Boundary Group. She had gone to the University of Montana on an academic scholarship, graduated with a degree in geospatial science, and had been measuring land for 10 years. She had her mother's steadiness and her father's precision, and she had a way of listening to a problem that made it feel smaller without minimizing it. Joe had always thought that was a rare skill. She picked up on the second ring. "Dad, Sarah, you got a few minutes. Always. What's wrong?" He told her. The measurement, the fence, the drainage channel. What would happen to the upper bench if the channel was blocked when the spring melt came down from the Rockies in March? Sarah listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "You measured from the state marker on Route 9? "Yes, 3 times. 3 times. "Okay, a pause. Call the HOA today before anything else. Document the call, time who you spoke to, what they said. Can you do that today?" "I can. And don't touch the fence." "I wasn't going to touch the fence. I know. I'm saying it anyway. I'll come up this weekend. You don't have to do that. Dad, it's 4 hours. Dad, I'll come up this weekend." He called the HOA management office at 9:30. A woman named Linda Marsh, the property manager, efficient, polished, the voice of someone who had delivered bad news to many people and learned to do it without sounding like she was enjoying it. Joe explained the situation. Linda Marsh said, "Our fence installation was conducted based on survey work commissioned by the HOA. I'm confident the installation is within the HOA's property boundaries." "The HOA doesn't own the drainage channel," Joe said. "I'm not in a position to litigate property disputes over the phone. Our installation team followed the survey markers precisely." "Which survey?" A brief pause. "I'd have to pull the documentation. I'd like to see it." "I can schedule a meeting with our property committee for papers shuffling 2 weeks from Thursday." 2 weeks. That's the earliest the committee is available. Joe thought about the upper bench, the spring melt, 4 months away. "All right," he said, 2 weeks from Thursday." He wrote down the time and date, Linda Marsh's name, the exact time of the call, 9:34 a.m., what she said, close to word for word. He put the notebook in the kitchen drawer where important things went. Then he went out to feed the cattle. That evening at dinner, Joe told Clara everything. The measurement, the call with Linda Marsh. The 2-week wait. Clara listened without interrupting, the way she listened to things that mattered. When he was done, she said, "Who did their survey?" "I don't know," she didn't say. Clara was quiet for a moment. She refilled his coffee. She sat back down. "I'll find out tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "I have a lunch hour," she said. His neighbor to the north was Walt Gruber, 72, third-generation Montana. Walt came by the next morning, drove his truck down the access road, and parked in front of the barn and stood looking at the new fence line without saying anything. Joe came out of the barn and stood beside him. "That's not in the right place," Walt said. "No, that's your drainage channel, yes." Walt had lived in the valley his whole life. He had helped Raymond regrade the channel outlet in 1974 after a rockslide partially blocked it. Walt would have been 22 that summer. He had come over with his father's equipment and spent 3 days on it because Raymond had asked, and because that was what neighbors did. "You calling a lawyer," Walt said. "Called my daughter first. She's a surveyor." Walt nodded. "You want me to talk to someone at the county? I know Gerald Taft pretty well." "I know Gerald Taft pretty well too," Joe said. Walt was quiet for a second. "Right," he said. "I know you do." He drove home. Joe went back to the barn, but Walt had come. Joe noted that. That afternoon, Clara drove to the county recorder's office in Browning on her lunch break. She did not tell Joe she was going. She went, asked her questions, and came home with a manila folder. She set it on the kitchen table that evening. The HOA filed their survey in September, she said. A company called Tri-State Land Services, out of Kalispell. She opened the folder, and Donna Feather told me something she said I should pass on. Tri-State has done 4 surveys in this county in the past 2 years, all 4 for Elk Ridge Estates, all 4 on properties adjacent to HOA land. Joe looked at the document, all 4. "That's not a coincidence," Clara said. "That's a practice." He looked at her across the table. "When did you become an investigator?" he said. "When someone put a fence on my husband's land." She sat down. "There's something else." I asked Donna which other properties Tri-State had surveyed. She gave me the names. 2 of them are people we know. Martin Eagleheart east of town. The Yazzie place on Route 12. Joe was quiet. "Martin and the Yazzies," he said. "Both have had boundary issues with HOA development in the past 18 months. Martin told me in October he thought someone had moved his fence markers, but he couldn't prove it. I didn't think much of it then." Both Martin Eagleheart and the Yazzie family were Blackfeet. Both had been in the valley as long as the Redclouds. Joe sat with the information. "I'm going to call Martin tomorrow," he said. "I thought you would." He called Martin the next morning. Martin Eagleheart was 68, a quiet man who ran a small hay operation 3 miles east of Browning. Martin listened to Joe's account of the fence without interrupting. Then he said, "Joe, come out here." Joe drove over. Martin walked him to his southern boundary. There were survey stakes in the ground, orange flags on wire pins that Martin said had appeared in September. They sat 12 feet north of where Martin's fence had always been. "Tri-State," Martin said. "Tri-State," Joe said. "I called the county. They said it's a private survey, not binding unless both parties agree. I said I don't agree. They said then it's a dispute. I said, how do I resolve a dispute? They said hire your own surveyor or get a lawyer, or wait to see what happens. Yes, or wait." Joe looked at the stakes. "Don't wait," he said. "My daughter is coming up this weekend. She's a licensed surveyor. I'll ask her to look at your line when she's done with mine." Martin looked at him. "She'd do that. I'll ask her." That evening, Joe told Clara what he had found. She listened. Then she said, 3 properties, all adjacent to Elk Ridge development, all with tri-state surveys in the same year, all owned by native families. Joe said nothing. "Say it plainly, Joe." "I'm saying it plainly in my head." "Then say it out loud." He looked at her. They're not doing this to the Dolan property, he said. They're not doing it to the Grubers. They're doing it to the people who are least likely to have the resources or the connections to push back effectively. And they are specifically choosing native landowners, people whose relationship to documented title is already complicated in the public mind, even when the documentation is completely clear. Clara nodded slowly. That's what I needed you to say out loud. It doesn't make it easier to prove, no, but it changes what you're fighting. You're not just fighting a fence, you're fighting a pattern. Between the HOA call and Sarah's weekend, two more things happened. The first was the insurance adjuster. Joe's homeowner's policy renewed in October. A young man named Pierce from an office in Great Falls. He walked the property for 2 hours, wrote down numbers, and told Joe his premium was going up 42%. 42, Joe said. Yes, sir. The risk profile has changed somewhat for properties adjacent to the new residential development. My property hasn't changed, no, sir. But the surrounding area. Pete Farrow's place is 3 miles north of here. He renewed last month. His premium went up 8%. Pierce looked at his paperwork. I can't speak to other clients' accounts. Pete Farrow told me himself. Every property is assessed individually, Mr. Redcloud. Joe looked at the number for a long time. Is this negotiable? I can put in a review request. 4 to 6 weeks. Joe signed the form. He put it in the drawer with the notebook and the other papers. The second thing was at the hardware store. Joe needed fencing staples. He went to Kruger's Hardware in Browning, where he had bought supplies for 35 years. Mike Kruger was behind the counter. He rang up the staples and then said, not looking up from the register, You know, Joe, I've been hearing some things. What things? From some of the HOA people. They're saying your property survey is off, that your family never had clear legal claim to the drainage channel, that there was confusion about the original homestead boundaries. Joe looked at Mike. That's what they're saying. I thought you should know. I appreciate that, Mike. The HOA does a lot of business here. A lot of the residents. Joe put his money on the counter. I know, he said. I've been buying here for 35 years. I know how business works. He picked up the staples and walked out. He sat in his truck in the parking lot. He did not start the engine for a few minutes. He connected the things. The insurance, Gerald Taft coming to the farm, Mike at the hardware store, Tri-State's pattern across 3 native properties. Each thing small on its own, each thing the kind of thing a man was supposed to dismiss, was expected to dismiss. He connected them anyway. He drove home. Sarah arrived Saturday morning with a truck full of equipment and the look she got when she had identified a problem and intended to solve it. After breakfast, Joe and Sarah went out to the fence line. Sarah set up her total station, a precision survey instrument that measured angles and distances to within a few millimeters. She mounted it on a tripod at the Route 9 state marker, confirmed the iron pipe's GPS coordinates against the state database on her laptop, and began shooting points along the fence. She moved methodically, field notebook in hand, small and red, writing the way Joe wrote. Specifically, without sentiment, numbers, and nothing but numbers. Joe walked the line with her. He answered questions when she asked and stayed out of her way when she didn't. After 2 hours, she moved the instrument to the northern terminus of the fence and repeated the process. Then she walked the line a third time with a measuring rod, checking select points by hand. At noon, they went back to the house. Sarah spread her field notes on the kitchen table. 18 feet 3.5 inches from the Route 9 marker to the HOA fence at the northernmost, she said. 18 feet 4.25 at the southernmost. The fence is inside your property line for its entire length. Not at one point, along the whole run. She looked up. That's not drift. That's not construction error. When a fence is consistently the same distance off along every point of its length, someone told the crew exactly where to put it. You'll file this with the county. Monday. It becomes part of the public record. She paused. Dad, I looked at the tri-state survey on the drive up. The self-placed benchmark they used is 3/4 of a mile from the Route 9 marker. At that distance, errors compound. You can make a fence land anywhere you want if you start from the right point. Could that be accidental? Sarah looked at him. No, she said. That's not accidental. That afternoon, Sarah drove over to Martin Eaglehart's property and spent 2 hours on his southern boundary. Her findings matched what Martin had suspected. The tri-state stakes were 11 feet north of Martin's actual line, as established by the 1962 county resurvey. She came back at dusk. She said, Joe, how many other properties has tri-state touched in this county? 4, all native-owned, all adjacent to Elk Ridge development. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to make a call. She called Dr. Valerie Cross at the Montana State Land Board. Dr. Cross was a senior surveyor with the agency responsible for maintaining the integrity of original land survey records in Montana. Sarah had worked with her twice on disputed boundary cases. She explained the situation. Not just the Redcloud fence, all 4 properties, the self-placed tri-state benchmark, the pattern. Dr. Cross said she would pull the original General Land Office plats and the 1962 county resurvey records and have an answer within a week. She called back in 4 days. She said, the original GLO survey from 1900 is unambiguous. The eastern boundary of the Redcloud property runs from the Route 9 corridor marker north along the natural drainage feature at a consistent setback of 14 to 18 feet east of the channel centerline. The drainage feature is entirely within the property. Sarah said, Can you put that in writing? I can have a formal finding issued within 2 weeks. A pause. Sarah, the tri-state survey, I've looked at it. I'm going to be reviewing their license. This is not the first time I've seen work like this. And I'm going to pull all 4 properties you mentioned. If the pattern holds across all 4, that's not a license review. That's a fraud referral to the Attorney General. The formal finding from the Montana State Land Board arrived in Joe's mail on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Sarah's visit. 4 pages, state seal on the cover. It stated clearly that the drainage channel on the eastern boundary of the Redcloud property had been established as part of the property in the original 1900 GLO survey and had remained within the legal boundaries in every subsequent filed survey, including the 1962 county resurvey that had set the Route 9 marker. It also stated that the survey filed by Tri-State Land Services in September contained a material error in baseline selection that rendered its property line determination invalid. Joe read it 3 times. Then he called Sarah. She said, Take it to the HOA board, in person. Bring everything. The State Land Board finding, the 1901 survey, George's notebook, your measurements. My filed survey. Let them see all of it at once. When? Call Voss directly, not the committee. Voss. Tell him you have a finding from the State Land Board and you need to meet this week. He called Voss's cell number. Voss answered. Joe said, I have a formal finding from the Montana State Land Board regarding the survey dispute on my eastern boundary. I need to meet with you this week. A pause. Mr. Redcloud. Our committee meets on. This week, Mr. Voss. Not the committee, you and me this week. A longer pause. Thursday, Voss said. My office, 10 o'clock. Joe put down the phone and looked at Clara. She was reading at the kitchen table. She looked up. Thursday, he said. I'll come, she said. You don't have to, I know. She went back to her reading. He sat down across from her. Clara, yes. He's going to try to make this feel like a simple mistake. Like they apologize, moved the fence, it's done. And maybe that's what happens. And if it does, then it's still not a mistake. It's a pattern, the insurance, Gerald coming to the farm, Mike at the hardware store, Martin's steaks, the Yazzies, all of it. I know it is, Clara said. You know it is. Knowing it doesn't mean you need to say it every time. He was quiet. It gets tired, he said. After a while it gets tired. She set down her book. She looked at him across the table. I know, she said. It's been tired for a long time. George was tired, Raymond was tired, you're tired. And Sarah's going to be tired when it's her turn. That's the inheritance too, not just the land, the tiredness. That's a hard thing to pass on, yes, but they don't get to change it by making you give up the land. You understand that. The tiredness is survivable. Losing the land isn't. He looked at her. You're a wise woman, he said. You've been telling me that for 38 years. At some point it would stop being a discovery. He almost laughed. That was what she could do when she decided to do it. That night, after Joe had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table alone. She thought about what Joe had said, the pattern, 3 native families, a Kalispell surveying company doing the same sleight of hand on 4 adjacent properties in the same 12 months. Each family fighting alone in their own county office with their own resources, not knowing the others were fighting the same thing. She got out 2 sheets of paper and a pen. The first letter was to the Montana State Land Board. Attention, Dr. Valerie Cross. Providing the names and contact information for Martin Eagleheart and the Yazzie family, and requesting that their properties be included in the formal review of Tri-State Land Services. The second letter was to the Glacier County Record, the local weekly paper, addressed to the editor. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote comments on her students' papers. Specific, factual, without flourish. 4 paragraphs describing the fence encroachment, the Tri-State Survey methodology, the State Land Board finding, and the pattern of 4 native-owned properties in the county affected by Tri-State's work in the same 12 months. She signed it with her name and her address and her 31 years of residence in Glacier County. She sealed the envelopes. She put them in her school bag to mail in the morning. She sat at the table a little longer. She thought about George Redcloud in 1901, a Northern Cheyenne man who had survived the Exodus as a boy, who had spent years on a reservation being told the boundaries of his life, who had walked away and filed a claim and then sat down to write in a small notebook. Whoever comes after must know. She thought about what it took to write a sentence like that. To believe, against a great deal of available evidence, that there would be someone coming after. That the coming after was worth preparing for. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Thursday morning, Joe and Clara drove to Elk Ridge Estates together. Sarah had driven up the night before and was in the back seat with a folder on her lap. Joe had told her what he had told her on the phone. He wanted to do the talking. She had said, I know, I'm here for technical questions, and to be a witness. The HOA administrative office was in the clubhouse. Derek Voss was there with Linda Marsh and a man named Blake Torrance, an attorney with a firm in Kalispell. Torrance was around 50, heavyset, with the careful face of a man who had spent decades in county property disputes and had learned not to show his hand early. He had not been at the committee meetings. His presence now told Joe 2 things. The HOA had known something serious was coming, and they had prepared for it. Joe put the folder on the table. He took out the State Land Board finding and set it in front of Derek Voss. He took out the 1901 survey and set it next to the finding. He took out George Redcloud's notebook, open to the November 1901 entry, and set it in the center of the table. He said, My great-grandfather filed the homestead claim in November of 1901. He noted specifically, in this notebook written in his own hand, that the drainage channel was inside the eastern boundary, and that anyone who came after needed to understand it. The State Land Board has confirmed that the channel has been within my property line in every legally valid survey since the original GLLO plat in 1900. Your surveyor's work is invalid because it used a self-placed benchmark rather than the established Route 9 state marker. The State Land Board is reviewing Tri-State Land Services license as a result. He looked at Blake Torrance. I don't want a legal fight, Joe said. What I want is simple. Move the fence to the correct property line. Restore the drainage channel access. Confirm in writing that the HOA will not challenge the 1901 eastern boundary going forward. Torrance picked up the State Land Board finding. He read the cover page slowly. He read the second page. His face did not change, but something in his posture did. The small adjustment of a man revising his understanding of where he stood. He set the finding down. He looked at the notebook. He said, Mr. Redcloud, the State Land Board finding applies to the public record. It doesn't automatically constitute a binding determination in a private property dispute between two parties. Sarah said, Montana Code Annotated 7015-101 provides that original GLO survey plats and subsequent state certified resurveys establish the legal boundaries of parcels derived from federal land grants. The State Land Board's finding confirms the Redcloud boundary as established in those surveys. That is binding under Montana law. Torrance looked at her, and you are. Sarah Redcloud, licensed land surveyor, Western Boundary Group. I filed a counter-survey with Glacier County this week using the Route 9 state marker as the datum point. My measurements are a matter of public record. Torrance was quiet for a moment. He turned to Voss. Voss was looking at the notebook, at George Redcloud's handwriting. The November 1901 entry, 123 years old, small and careful and still legible. This is your great-grandfather's, Voss said. Yes, he wrote this in 1901. November, a few weeks after he filed the claim. Voss read the entry again. Something moved across his face. Joe watched it and could not entirely read it. Calculation, possibly. Or something genuinely unexpected. The look of a man encountering evidence that does not fit the story he has been telling himself. Could we have a few minutes, Voss said. Take the time you need, Joe said. He and Clara and Sarah went to the coffee station. They stood with their cups and did not talk much. Through the glass partition, Joe could see Voss and Torrance in low conversation. Torrance was doing most of the talking. Voss was listening with his arms folded. Linda Marsh was taking notes. Sarah said quietly, Torrance knows the Montana Code argument holds. He'll recommend they settle. Yes, Joe said. Clara held her coffee cup with both hands and watched through the glass and said nothing. After 12 minutes, Torrance opened the door. Mr. Redcloud, could you come back in? They came back in. Torrance said, given the State Land Board's finding and the counter-survey on file, the HOA is prepared to commission a new survey using the Route 9 marker as the required datum point. If the new survey confirms your measurement, and I want to be honest with you, I believe it will. The fence will be relocated within 30 days. In writing, Joe said, we can prepare a written agreement. Before I leave today. Torrance looked at Voss. Voss nodded. The nod of a man who has looked at the arithmetic and found it unfavorable. Before you leave today, Torrance said. They waited 40 minutes for the agreement to be typed and printed. Joe read it carefully. Sarah read it over his shoulder. She pointed to one clause and Joe asked for a clarification, and they got it added as an addendum. Joe signed. Voss signed. Linda Marsh witnessed. Joe folded his copy and put it in his shirt pocket. He picked up George's notebook from the table. He looked at Derek Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, "whether you authorize the encroachment personally or not, when I raised the issue, the first response was a 2-week wait. Then silence while the county commissioner came to my farm to suggest I think carefully about the cost of a legal fight. Then someone began telling people in town that my family's title was uncertain. I want you to know I am aware of all of it. I'm not asking you to answer for it today. I'm telling you so the record is clear." Voss said nothing. Joe picked up his folder and walked out with Clara and Sarah. In the parking lot, Walt Gruber was there. Joe stopped. Walt was parked against the curb in his truck. Martin Eaglehart was parked behind him. And behind Martin, a truck with a Yazzie Ranch decal on the rear window. Clara had called Martin the evening before, after Joe had set the Thursday meeting. Martin had told the Yazzies. They had not come inside. They had not been asked to come at all. Joe looked at Walt. Walt said, "Clara mentioned the meeting." Joe looked at the 3 trucks, Walt, Martin, the Yazzies, 2 of them native families who had been in this valley as long as the Redclouds, all of them sitting in the cold for an hour in a parking lot outside a meeting they had not been invited to. He walked to Martin's window. Martin rolled it down. "Sarah filed a counter-survey for your line too," Joe said. "The State Land Board is reviewing Tri-State's license across all 4 properties." Martin nodded. "I heard," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner." Martin looked at him. "You came when you could," he said. "That's what we do." They drove home. The new survey was conducted 3 weeks later by a firm from Great Falls. The surveyor used the Route 9 marker. His finding matched Joe's measurement to within half an inch. On the 15th day of the 27-day wait, Joe was fixing fence on the north side of the property when he looked up and saw a truck parked on the county road near his eastern boundary. 2 men in orange vests were out with a tripod and a total station. One of them was kneeling at the Route 9 state marker, setting up from the iron pipe. Joe watched them for a long moment. He did not walk over. He did not say anything. They were using the right starting point. He picked up his pliers and went back to the fence. The relocation crew came on the 27th day, the first week of December. They were efficient and professional and did the job in a day and a half. When they were done, the drainage channel ran free from the county road to the tree line the way it had run since 1908. Joe watched the relocation from the rise above the upper bench. When the crew had gone, he walked down to the channel. The water in it was a trickle now. The cold had nearly frozen it. But he had watched enough springs come through this valley to know what the trickle became when the snow came down from the Rockies in March. It would run full and clear. It would carry the water north and away from the bench. The hay ground would be dry and productive the way it was supposed to be. He stood there for a while. He thought about George digging this in 1908 with a borrowed mule. A northern Cheyenne man, 40 years old by then, who had survived the Exodus as a boy and the reservation years as a young man, and who had pointed a borrowed mule at frozen ground and said, "Here, this is where the water goes," and then written it down for people he would never know. He thought about what it takes to do that. To believe the writing down will matter. To do it anyway when you're not sure. He thought about the notebook, still in the metal box in the equipment shed, waiting for what he intended to add to it tonight. Sarah was behind him. She had come down from the house when she saw him walking out. "You okay?" she said. "Yes, you don't look okay. I'm thinking." She came and stood beside him. "About George," she said. "Yes, me too." They stood for a while without talking. She said, "Dad, I want to ask you something. Go ahead." "When you found the notebook, When you read what George wrote about the Peterson dispute in 1923, the part about showing them the original filing, did you know you were going to win? He thought about it. I knew the facts were on our side, he said. I didn't know that would be enough. It's not always enough. But it was this time. This time it was. Because of the State Land Board finding, and your equipment and your knowledge, and Donna Feather telling your mother about Tri-State, and Martin sitting in that parking lot, and your mother putting it in the newspaper. Sarah looked at him. Mom put it in the newspaper. 2 nights before Thursday. She didn't tell me until after. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That's very Mom, she said. Yes, it is. Did it work? Donna called 3 days after the paper ran. 3 other property owners in adjacent counties contacted the county recorder's office after reading Clara's letter. Same issue, different HOA, same tri-state. Sarah nodded slowly. She said, I've been thinking about what you said about being tired, about the inheritance. I meant it honestly. It's not just the land. It's the whole weight of it. I need to understand that, not just the boundary surveys and the soil science, the other part. What do you want to understand? How do you keep going? After Gerald came to the farm, after the insurance, after Mike at the hardware store, when you can see it everywhere, all the small ways they're doing it, and you can't prove most of it individually, and each piece alone is too small to matter. He was quiet. You know what George wrote in 1923, he said. After the Peterson dispute, he showed him the filing map and they shook hands. 3 pages later, same year, George writes, Peterson was fair. Not all of them will be, but you bring the document anyway. You bring it because sometimes it works, and you can't know ahead of time which times those are. And the bringing of it is what keeps the record alive. Sarah was quiet. That's the answer, he said. You bring the document, you keep the record, not because it always works, because sometimes it works. And the record is the proof that you were here, that you understood what was yours, that you didn't hand it over because someone made you tired. She looked at the channel. George wrote that in 1923. Yes, he was thinking about whoever came after. He didn't know it was us, but it was. A long pause. She said, I want to tell my children this someday. Bring them here and show them the channel, and tell them George dug it in 1908, and someone tried to take it, and we got it back because he wrote it down. Then tell them the hard parts too. Why the hard parts? Because George didn't leave out the hard parts. He wrote, not all of them will be fair. He knew. He wrote it anyway. The hard parts are what make the rest of it true. She nodded. Then she said, one more thing. Ask the HO people, the 400 families in those houses. Most of them don't know what the HOA did. Most of them aren't bad people. No, most of them aren't. But they elected Derek Voss. They pay the dues that paid for Blake Torrance. They benefit from whatever the HOA does, whether they know about it or not. Yes. So what does a good person do in that position? He thought about it. A good person asks, he said. They read the meeting minutes. They show up to the meetings. They ask about the fence on their neighbor's boundary. They don't assume that because they didn't authorize something, it wasn't done on their behalf. And if they find out something wrong was done, then they do what Walt did. Walt sat in a parking lot for an hour in the cold. Yes, that's not nothing. No, it's not everything either, but it's something. The world is mostly built out of some things, not out of everythings. People who do everything are rare. People who show up, who say it's wrong, who sit in the parking lot in the cold. There are more of those. And they add up. Clara called from the house. Dinner was ready. The light was going the way Montana light goes into December, fast and without apology. They walked back up the rise together, across the frozen grass, toward the house where the kitchen light was on, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up in the cold, still air. At the door, Sarah stopped. "Dad!" "Yes." "Thank you for calling me. Thank you for coming. I'll always come." "I know," he said. "That's why I called." They went inside. The kitchen was warm. It smelled like the soup Clara had been making since noon. The smell of a house that is used and maintained and cared for. The smell of continuity. Not glamorous. In the end, the only smell that matters. Joe hung up his coat. He washed his hands at the sink. He looked out the window at the dark field and the darker tree line to the east, and, barely visible in the fading light, the slight depression in the ground where the drainage channel ran. Still there, still his, still doing what George Redcloud had intended it to do in 1908. After dinner, while Clara read and Sarah talked to her office in Missoula, Joe took George's notebook from the metal box on the equipment shed shelf. He carried it inside to the kitchen table. He turned to a blank page near the back. He wrote the date at the top. He wrote what had happened: the fence, the measurement, the tri-state survey, the state land board finding. Sarah's equipment, Donna Feather at the recorder's office. Clara's 2 letters, Walt and Martin and the Yazzie truck in the parking lot. The agreement signed at the clubhouse. The fence relocated in December. The survey crew at the Route 9 marker on day 15. He wrote it plainly, the way George had written. At the bottom he wrote, "The drainage channel is intact. The boundary stands. To whoever comes after, the Route 9 marker on the county road is the reference point. Measure from there. The original GLO plat is on file at the county. The State Land Board finding is in the kitchen drawer alongside this notebook. Not all of them will be fair. But you bring the document anyway. That is what keeps the record alive." He put the notebook back in the oilcloth. He put it in the metal box. He put the box in the drawer with the other papers. The State Land Board finding, the 1901 survey, the signed HOA agreement, the insurance form, the notes from the call with Linda Marsh, Clara's copy of her letter to the Glacier County Record. He closed the drawer. He sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet house. Clara turned a page. Studs ticked. The wind worked at the corners of the frame building that George Redcloud had built in 1894. Outside, the land lay still and cold and dark under the first stars coming out over the Rockies. The drainage channel George Redcloud had dug in 1908 lay in it the way it had always lain, without fanfare, doing its quiet necessary work, carrying the water where the water needed to go, waiting for spring.